you could see a traditional church being like, man, these churches nowadays, all they do is market, and they got Facebook, and they got all that. And it's like, well, that's fine, but 25 years ago, you guys were knocking on doors. That's the original form of marketing.
Right.
It's like, man, I'm literally a door-to-door salesman with this gospel thing, so it's, to me, that's a good example. That's a straw man, obviously, but it's just an example of, like, we want to be, we're just kind of selective about what we get all bent out of shape about with this stuff, or, man, the church is getting practical. It's too much like a business. But to your point, well, do you have, are you working with an auditor? Do you have an accounting software? Do you use, we're all using these super practical systems that are not Bible. Nothing in the Bible tells us we need to pay our people in a certain way that gives them a housing allowance and blah, blah, blah. We could sit here for hours and talk about all the things that have nothing to do with the Bible that every responsible church is doing. But we get like a few things that we just want to be like super selective, like, man, we don't want to be driven by pragmatism. We want to be driven by like the Bible, So I get it, I think that's a little funny.
This is Breaking Barriers, where we help pastors and churches grow so that they can go.
All right, welcome to the Breaking Barriers podcast. My name is Pastor Bobby. This is Pastor Andrew, and today we're going to be talking about kind of an individual leadership topic about how we grow as leaders in, I think, really kind of all areas of our life, but specifically in the church and specifically as church leaders. And so here's the concept that I want us to kind of talk about today. And I'm sure as you kind of hear this and you kind of get the concept for today, I'm sure you're going to, have different ideas about maybe where you've seen this happen in your life or, maybe areas that you can grow in this. And here's the concept, and it comes out of Proverbs 17. I'll share the verse in just a moment. A lot of times, especially if somebody becomes a Christian a little bit later in life as a teenager or even as an adult, when you become a believer, you realize, wait a minute, there's a true set of facts that exist in the world that now I need to kind of wrap my life around these things. God is a certain way, the Bible's a certain way, God doesn't change. And, in many ways, it's like that's what Orthodox Christianity is, right? Like wanting to lock into those things. That's why there's creeds, that's why there's all of this stuff. And that's really, really good. As a believer, as a church leader, you need to know those things that are close-handed, that don't change, that you lock into.
Right.
The problem is there's a whole nother way of thinking that the Bible talks about that is different than that, and it's the whole category of wisdom and how to be a wise person. Because for wisdom, and this is kind of the definition of wisdom in many ways, for wisdom, there's not always a black and white answer of exactly what you should do in that situation, which is why we need wisdom. And the way Proverbs 17:10 talks about this, and when I first read this verse, it really struck me, and I really think it kind of typifies what we're talking about today. It says, a rebuke cuts into a perceptive person more than 100 lashes into a fool. And so what it's setting up here is, in Proverbs, you have the wise person, you have the kind of what wisdom is, and then you have the foolish person, and you have what foolishness is. And Proverbs here presents a wise person as being very perceptive, and that like one rebuke, hey, you should do it this way, not this way. Hey, this is what you should do in your life. It cuts into that wise person very, very quickly, very simply, very easily. For the fool, 100 lashes into the fool, and they still haven't changed their mind around something. And I just think that's very interesting where, there are things that we want to lock into that we don't want to change, but then there's other areas of our life. If we're unwilling to change, then Proverbs puts us in the category of being a fool.
Right.
If we're fixed in our thinking and we're unwilling to change. If we're unwilling to ever take advice, to ever take a rebuke from somebody else, for someone else to speak into our life. And we've all probably been that way, and we've all met those people where you try to speak something you think is probably pretty clear into somebody else's life, and somebody's very resistant to that. In many ways, Proverbs says, that's foolishness. And so what I want to do today is take that concept and say, okay, how do we apply that to church leadership and what we do as church leaders? How have we seen this play out at Mercy Hill? How have we seen this play out in our life? So any just kind of general thoughts there?
Well, I think that, one of the things when you start talking about leadership is you're not talking about sin. So like when you're using the term rebuke, you're not really talking about like, man, this person is caught in adultery and they're taking the rebuke, and is that wisdom or not? Because that really is, there are a lot of things in this discussion that are black and white.
Right.
There's sin issues or clear God's will issues where He's called us, your sanctification, His mission, that kind of thing. But then when you're talking about leadership wise, then it's like, man, do you have the heart and attitude to think about being open to other people's ideas? I mean, that's truly what humility is the openness to other ideas, to be able to look back and be like, man, I probably could have done that differently, or I want to do that differently going forward. That there's just like a personality trait or like a growth characteristic that comes, for some people that I think achieve very high levels of success, that they're just willing to change. They're willing to move, to grow, instead of being just fixed and kind of static when it comes to leadership and the way they're going after their goals and that kind of thing is not a static thing. It's a dynamic thing.
Right. Yeah. One of the things that got me kind of thinking about this is, I actually heard there's lots of business and kind of secular books that talk about these types of concepts, and a lot of them use a lot of different language. And I remember listening to a podcast, and they were talking about this idea of in areas of wisdom, like being willing to change, a willingness to receive correction from other people, to receive input from other people. And I just thought, I thought, man, this to me sounds, what they're explaining sounds more like a biblical concept to me. And which is, why I ended up kind of tracing it to the Proverbs with this idea of basically a wise person and a foolish person. And so let's talk about maybe some areas in the church or in church leadership that this happens. One of the ways for me when I think about this concept, and maybe this will help people kind of understand the concept. You just think about good Orthodox churches that believe the Bible. There's things that we do in 2024 that churches were not doing in 2000 and churches were not doing 20 years prior in 1980. And so I do think there around this concept, there is this ability to be able to say, okay, what is fixed? What is Bible? What needs to change? You think about, any sort of like worship wars going into the past, or you think about people that were so committed to doing Sunday school. And now it's like most churches now are like, community groups, you know what I mean? And it's like, well, all of those things had to go through that filter of, wait a minute, this isn't necessarily a hard and fast Bible issue rule, whether people get their fellowship on Sunday morning in a Sunday school class, or whether this, people are getting their fellowship from meeting in somebody's house. But there are churches and there are church leaders that weren't able to make that jump, in some of those different areas. And you end up getting left behind, or your church ends up getting left behind. Yeah,
I think a lot of that comes because you have theologized something that was really just a practical application. The Bible part of like what you're talking about, like the Bible part of it is we're not supposed to do Christianity alone. Whether you're a Sunday school person or a community group person, that's what we all agree on, right? Like there's, however many one another passages in Scripture, and man, it's a team game, and it's, we're herd creatures. God has cultivated us that we would grow together. The problem is when someone begins to start attaching a bunch of Bible verses to why they do it a certain way. You know, that they do Sunday school because of X, Y, Z, or they're only going to do this curriculum because of X, Y, Z, and they begin to attach a bunch of theology and, you know, Bible, like you're saying, to a specific method or practice of what it actually, you know, should have been something that was always flexible. I remember a good example of this from a church that we've learned from, and they were moving into their first permanent facility. And the problem was, of course, they had attached the value of, we want to be a generous church, right? Which is good. We want to be generous, but they had attached that so much to their crappy facilities. You know, like, man, those chairs are, you know, they're a piece of junk chairs. They're uncomfortable, and that's because we're sacrificing all this money to the mission. Well, then when it came time for them to actually move into a place that didn't have a bunch of junky chairs, it was disorienting for people because they had been like, what kind of chairs you have is a practical application. It's not a Bible verse, but when you have attached it to generosity and attached it to things that are Bible, now all of a sudden it's like, well, that feels like it has to be hard and fast in stone forever, because if not, then you're turning your back on something scripturally. And they had like a whole battle they had to go through over like the chair. Okay, no, the chairs are not actually, you know, that's not Bible. Like, we can have better chairs, and that doesn't mean we're not generous. And they had to go through this whole reconstruction with people because they had theologized something that was always supposed to be practical, wisdom-based, you know, man, best practice. Hey, can we get better? Or, you know, can we get better in the future from where we're at now? That's what it all should have been, but instead it turned into like a Bible verse, and then people didn't know what to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you got to kind of recognize it. There's a ton of what we do as church leaders that is just simply wisdom and best practices. It's not like Bible.
Right.
I mean, a ton of what we do. And there's nothing wrong with that. You know what I mean? It's like, man, it's all God's wisdom and God's truth, you know, kind of under the sun. Like, there's nothing wrong with, you know, the fact that like not everything we do has like a specific verse and a specific chapter. But it's to me, it's like having that type of spirit,
right?
You know, where it's like, man, where God says this is black and white, like I want to just believe that. I want to, man, just, you know, come under whatever God's saying. But then in things that are a little bit more unclear, I want to be like some of the leaders in Acts that were willing to kind of roll with the punches and see what God's doing and have that sort of flexibility to say, hey, maybe we need to change this. Maybe we need to do this. I mean, the book of Acts is just filled, you know, with those sort of stories. And, you know, you can get the sense when you get around people that kind of understand this concept, and it has really worked its way into just kind of their leadership style, you know? Like I'm sure, you know, anybody even listening to this has been at different conferences and stuff. And I was at a conference recently, and you could tell when you get around somebody like this, you know, there were some churches that were there that are much bigger churches than we are. And, you know, sometimes you can get around people like this, and, you know, I'll just give you an example. Like, you know, I was talking about something that Mercy Hill does or whatever, you know, and it was different than how their church does it. And this person immediately was like wanting to hear more about it, because it didn't matter that their church was 5 times larger than ours. They were the sort of person that were like, oh, wait a minute. That sounds interesting what you're doing. Tell me more about it. Like, maybe I can learn this from you. Maybe I can take this from you. And that's the sort of person that is going to continue to be able to grow, even as the world changes, even as the church changes. And so it's just, for me, it's just developing a spirit of that.
Yeah, I've seen this firsthand in some of the greatest leaders that I've been around. Probably the two leaders that I have the closest relationship with that are you know, way ahead in a lot of areas that I've seen this from that come immediately to my mind is J.D. Greer and Larry Osborne. I mean, J.D., in all seriousness, I mean, when I was at the summit, I mean, he wants feedback after every time he preaches, and it doesn't matter if you're an intern or executive pastor. If you have something that's going to be of value, he wants it. there's a lot of humility in that, but it's also like what you're getting at. It's like, man, it's a growth mindset of even the sermon that I just gave is not fixed. It can always grow, morph, get better. The next iteration of it can be better. I mean, it's just this whole way of thinking that is like, man, we're going to continue to climb the mountain every single time we do it, or every time we, every day we're going to try to get a little bit better. I think about this with Larry Osborne as well, because Larry is he's just the purveyor of this. I mean, he, in a lot of ways, he was kind of the father of the modern multi-site movement in terms of, I mean, they were the first ones to pop a, video. I know this is kind of debated, but they were like the first ones to pop a video, and hey man, I wonder if we could do a video of the sermon in a different setting. And, he comes home and tells Nancy, his wife, like, I think we may have just stumbled on something. And, it's like, man, if everything had been attached with black and white and there's a verse for that for every single thing, it's hard to innovate. It's hard to grow into something new. And instead of that, to hold what is primary, which is, man, we have a mission. We believe in the preaching of the word. We believe the scripture, changes people's lives. The power, the gospel is the power of God unto salvation. Okay, we're going to try to get that out as much as we can. Now let's do a video venue for a video cafe, and they did it, and it works. And now the whole landscape of the American church is just, 20 years is just radically different. And who knows what the next iteration will be. But if it only comes from having a spirit, like you're saying, of doesn't matter how successful, doesn't matter how far ahead I think I am, man, I just have a humble spirit to say, man, I want to keep climbing the mountain here and keep growing, keep changing.
Yeah, I remember you and I have both had the opportunity to be in some different coaching groups that he leads. And I remember last year I was in this group, and he was kind of sharing the story a little bit of how he kind of came up with that idea. And, he was just saying that, even some of their team and different, like everybody was just like, because it's not the way it is now.
Right.
Where, I think like 20% of people go to a multi-site church in America, which is crazy, just how the landscape has changed. It wasn't like that 20 years ago. And he was just saying, like, nobody thought that would work. Like, everybody just thought, man, there's no way you're going to, for them, it was like being on the same campus, not even a different campus, being on the same campus and going to a different room and watching this sermon on video, People were just like, there's no way that's going to work, But he just had that sort of way of thinking of, okay, we can go try this and maybe this is, and I think multi-site is a really good example of this, where, I can't tell you how many leaders that I know that at some point they're like, we will never do multi-site, we will never, ever for any reason show our sermon on a video. And then, 5 years later, 10 years later, it's like, man, they're crushing it over there in the multi-site scene,
It's all theory until you face a full room. Mm-hmm. And then once that happens, it's like we've both seen that. I'm laughing because, it's very principled until you got a full room. People are trying to come in and you realize, man, people are lost, dying, and going to hell. And then it's like, we got to do something here. Right. And it's always the same progression, right? It's like, I know this is getting a little off topic, but it goes, man, we would never do multi-site. To then it's like, okay, we'll do multi-site, but only live preaching, right? It's always, that one's always next. Right. And then it's like, hey, you realize you got 4 different communicators spending half their whole week trying to get together with a sermon that you're then trying to have aligned so you can have groups. And then they're finally like, okay, well, I guess we'll do video. It's always the same kind of, but it's hard. It's hard when you have kind of made a principle, a theology, a stand. We will never, it's hard to kind of walk that back. It's maybe better to have a little bit of openness on the front end of all that stuff.
Right. Yeah, that's why I started the podcast talking about like doctrine and wisdom, because I think for me, when I was like at the height of that way of thinking, I think was like right at the very end of seminary. Yeah. Where you get 3 years of doctrine, which is great, but you end up looking at everything through the lens of doctrine, which is not super great, because one, there's tons of stuff the Bible don't even talk about. You know what I mean? Like the Bible don't tell your church what accounting system to use.
Right.
Or what your balance sheet should look like.
Right.
Well, it may say some stuff about the balance sheet, debt or something like that, but it's not going to give you a bunch of that. That's all in the area of wisdom, and for some reason, some people just struggle with that. I would love for you to talk about, because we have talked about this a lot, and I think sometimes people look into Mercy Hill and they, either think this is a good thing or they kind of throw stones at this. Mm-hmm. We have been totally okay realizing, man, there is some doctrinal stuff we hold on to in the Bible, and then there's a lot of stuff that the Bible don't speak to that we need to have this flexibility around.
Right. Yeah, one thing is, like, people are selective in what they want to be principled about or not. So a church might come out with like a program. I could see, this is really a straw man. I'm kind of making it up, but like you could see a traditional church being like, man, these churches nowadays, all they do is market, and they got Facebook and they got all that. And it's like, well, that's fine, but 25 years ago, you guys were knocking on doors. That's the original form of marketing.
Right.
It's like, man, I'm literally a door-to-door salesman with this gospel thing, So it's, to me, that's a good example. That's a straw man, obviously, but it's just an example of, like, we want to be, we're just kind of selective about what we get all bent out of shape about with this stuff, or, man, the church is getting practical. It's too much like a business. But to your point, well, do you have, are you working with an auditor? Do you have an accounting software? Do you use, we're all using these super practical systems that are not Bible. Nothing in the Bible tells us we need to pay our people in a certain way that gives them a housing allowance and blah, blah, blah. We could sit here for hours and talk about all the things that have nothing to do with the Bible that every responsible church is doing. But we get like a few things that we just want to be like super selective, like, man, we don't want to be driven by pragmatism. We want to be driven by like the Bible, So I get it, I think that's a little funny. That we're that way, that we just have this selective kind of, but the other thing I've seen is within the church, not even church leaders, there's a real inability sometimes to understand gray. Mm-hmm. Because I think that a lot of people think that because the Bible is inspired and inerrant, that it holds the answer for every single thing there is under the sun, including science, medicine, history, geography, and I think what people think is, like, when we say, hey, there's some things in the Bible are gray, what they think is, no, that means we just don't understand it enough. Like, if we could think about it more and better and with more insight, then we would know who Gog and Magog are, and we would understand exactly what from the book of Revelations, and we would understand, every single thing about Israel and all this. And it's like, no. What I'm saying is there are areas where the Bible is gray. Inherently, there's no more, any more studying you're trying to do to make it black and white is just reading into it. Mm-hmm. It's gray on purpose. Sometimes the Bible does this on purpose. Answer a fool according to his folly. Don't answer a fool according, it's like the Bible's trying to get you to see something that I think is very hard for a lot of believers. And that is, every situation you come across in life is not going to be black and white. There's not always a right or wrong in how to handle different situations,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I will say, for me, a lot of the times I get emails or something like that, it's around situations like that where people, they just can't handle the idea that one Christian might react one way, one Christian might react the other way, and one of them may not be wrong. Because the Bible doesn't spell out exactly what you're supposed to do when your company goes woke and affirming. Are you supposed to quit?
Right.
Are you making money for them and they're giving it away to some, or can you work there and be a missionary? It's like Christians are going to have two different reactions to that, but some people just can't handle living in that kind of ambiguity.
Yeah. Yeah, I think of some examples, of maybe different areas that we could apply this to, real specifically in like church leadership. Like I remember recently somebody was talking to me about like, how larger churches typically begin to organize in terms of like staff structure. Got lead pastor and executive pastor and just all these different like titles and levels and everything. And I was just like, and I feel like it surprised the person. I was like, hey, none of that's like in the Bible, right? Like
Right.
it's all of us just trying to figure out, like there's a concept of like, pastors and deacons and there's obviously real kind of general, the way the church should be organized. But in terms of like, well, who exactly reports to who? And do you have a leadership team? Do you have an executive team? Do you have one like how all that stuff works, who the campus pastors report to? I'm like, all of that's in the category of wisdom. We're trying to learn from others. We're trying to do our best. We're trying to learn from our own mistakes.
Right.
I also think about for us, I know one that I can point to real specifically is, we had like a connections process at Mercy Hill, like most churches do, and what stands behind the connections process is very much a biblical unchanging thing, which is like, okay, we're trying to make disciples. We're trying to give people a pathway to grow in their faith. When they come into Mercy Hill, maybe they get baptized here and they're trying to figure out what to do next. It was probably, 2 or 3 years in at Mercy Hill, we realized like, hey, we're doing our best with this connections process, but there's probably a much better way to do this. And we basically just took what some other churches were doing, Church of the Highlands, for example, some other different churches, and we just kind of reinvented our connections process, which is our weekender process now. That I think has been very helpful for us. It's been very helpful for other churches. And that is in that category, I think, of like gray area wisdom. We kept the biblical principle of like, hey, we're trying to disciple people. We're trying to give people the next step. But there's a lot of different ways that you can connect people in your church. Any other things like that come to mind for you?
I mean, I think one thing you're hitting on that I think has been true of us is we have had no problem with pragmatic stuff from the very beginning at all. I mean, just not had any like, we don't feel slimy about it. There's no ickiness. Just because for me, I'm a pretty analytical guy, and I'm like, man, I can point to any church under the in America and immediately name 10 things they're doing that are pragmatic.
Using a microphone.
What? Yeah. I mean, whatever. Why do you have air conditioner? Oh, you guys are just pandering to consumers. I mean, it's kind of crazy. Like,
why do you drive cars to church?
We're all super, pragmatic. So I just have no problem with it. I'm like, well, if we're all going to be that, which we are, and I think we have no reason not to be, then why not be good at it?
Right.
And part of being good at it is not feeling like that you're doing something wrong if you the other iteration is, I think churches say, okay, fine, we're going to be pragmatic, but it has to be kind of spirit-led, so it's got to be unique to us. You've seen this. I mean, we can't just take somebody else's idea and do it, because that would be like non-authentic.
Right.
It's got to be like our thing, we've got to, and we've just never had a problem with that, right or wrong. Like, I mean, we just rip stuff all the time. Like that looks awesome. That worked. I mean, I'll give you an example. Like we had last year, we did one of the churches that we coach, they do a huge pre-Easter Good Friday walkthrough where people walk through all the way, and they do all these scenes of Jesus. And I mean, this is very old school. We used to do kind of stuff like this in my little church growing up. And they were talking to me about it. I mean, in their church, probably half our size. And I was just like, dude, that's incredible. And it's engaging. And I'm like, man, I want to bring my family to something like that. Wouldn't you want to like pray with your kids and walk them through this whole thing? And it's very youth groupy, like you're hitting nails into a cross and you're just doing all the stuff. And I was like, I just got them to send me all their stuff. They had ripped it from some church in Florida. And we just took it and ripped it right from them. I mean, pictures and everything. And we're just like, hey man, we're just going to do this. And I've just never had any kind of problem with that at all. Like, man, we want to do things that are, good, practical. They move us towards the missional ends that we have. There are some things that are fixed, but most of the way that we do stuff is not very fixed. One thing I want to ask you was, when you think about this concept of being able to grow, change, at the same time, we talk a lot about flywheel. And flywheel, the idea of flywheel is don't change. If you're changing your flywheel every 2 years for growth, you're probably just not giving it enough time, to actually be effective. So, how do you think about that? Like, you don't want to be the Radio Shacks or Blockbusters, right? That could never adapt and change. At the same time, you don't want to be, well, actually, I think my analogy, I think you don't want to be Blockbuster or Radio Shack. you don't want to, Blockbuster never changed. Radio Shack was changing all the time, right? And so you don't want to be on either one of those spectrums. How do you think about, we want to grow, but we also want to have a flywheel?
Right. Yeah, I don't know that there's like an easy answer to that because, I mean, all of the greatest churches that we know now, most of them will be dead 100 years from now. And that's just the way the world works. And that's obviously the way God has set it up in his sovereignty. And some of the greatest companies and businesses, that we know of now that are, world domination, they won't exist 100 years from now. And because what you're saying is exactly true. Like, it's a struggle. I think the more success that you have, the harder it is to have this kind of flexibility and kind of wisdom and continue to change because, once you see things working really well, you're like, well, we don't need to change this because it's working really good, right? And almost any church that you know of that is dying now had a heyday at some point, right? Mm-hmm. Where stuff was like really working and what they were doing seemed effective. And at some point they really kind of locked into that and were unwilling to change, Mm-hmm. So I don't know what the exact like threshold is of like, okay, we have our core flywheel, we have our core mission, and then there's some tactics, there's some different ways that we go about it that can have some flexibility and can kind of change. That's probably the way that I would think about it. But even in doing that, I'm sure you could kind of, go sideways at some point because it is a challenge. I've even seen that with us. Like, there were things during COVID that all churches had to just change whether they liked it or not. If you wanted to exist for the next 12 months, like you had to change. Mm-hmm. And we did change. And, we experienced some stuff out of that was like, hey, that was a good idea. That was a good idea that we did that. That's helpful to us. Mm-hmm. But then, we're 4 or 5 years in now at that point, and there are some of those things that you want to lock into that may keep you from being able to continue to change going into the future.
Right.
And, there's so many examples of this. Even in sports, and even in football, it's like things get kind of locked in, right? There's a certain way of coaching. There's certain types of defense. And then, man, every now and again, out of nowhere, a coach that thinks of things differently, a player that thinks of things differently. And then all of a sudden, 5 years later, it's like, oh, a totally different type of defense, a totally different type of offense.
Right.
How do you think about it?
Well, Saban, Nick Saban said adapt or die, and he's just like, how can you span 2 decades, and so your sports analogy to me is right. If you just think about the teams early on versus when he just quit, it almost don't even look like the same game anymore, but they're willing to change, willing to adapt, willing to move. To me, this whole thing is kind of a struggle. I feel like the rebuke thing that you mentioned is easier a little bit. It's hard to be rebuked, but I've had different experiences in my life. Even with you, it's like we've had where I needed to hear something, and it's like, well, man, it's hard, but you got to hear it. And a lot of times, you don't react well or whatever, but it's like, man, you just keep chewing on it and come back, and God changes you through that stuff. There's just no doubt in my mind. I could give you a bunch of examples. Maybe we should talk about some of that. The harder part to me, I think about what you're saying, is the wisdom piece of, I mentioned that book one time, Thou Shalt Prosper. He talked about the ability to see the future. It's kind of like great leaders can see the future, and they change accordingly. See, I get frozen in, I don't want to change until we're seeing negative results, because I feel like, man, just keep riding that horse, that got us here. But the problem is, if you wait long enough to start actually seeing the tide turn before you're willing to change, it's probably too late, to change. So, and so that's why, like, for me, sometimes you bring me stuff or our executive teams bring me stuff. I'm thinking of a good example right now. We're doing this leadership cohort, and they want to change it from 18 months to 12 months or something like. And my big reaction is like, why? Mm-hmm. Why would you guys want to do that? Like, it's great. Like, it was a huge success. I think it being 18 months was part of the success. And they still want to adapt it and move because they think it can get better. I still think I'm right about that one. But you know what I mean? Like, it's just, that's not the easiest thing for me. It's easy for me when we're not getting the results we want to change stuff. But I think, really good leaders see the future and they're willing to change things even when they're going well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's close on real practical application and just think about maybe one from each of us, like how, for somebody that wants to get better at this, right? Or they want to grow at this, like, what's some advice that maybe we would give them, because I think you framed it up pretty well. Like, from the sake of Proverbs 17:10, when we're just talking about pure correction, like when somebody comes and they actually just correct us. Hey, brother, the way you were speaking to your kids or the way you were speaking to your wife, it may not be sin, but it sounds like, man, that you were getting on the border of being harsh. Like, man, I've been there, I've been in your shoes, that's somebody kind of correcting us. I think we can kind of understand that. The softer way to say something like that is, are we the sort of person that can even just take coaching? Just coaching around our leadership, coaching around, our life. And so, maybe what's a word of advice from each of us on maybe kind of practical application? I would say for me, one of the things that's been really helpful in life is just to get around a lot of different people that think differently, that maybe do things differently, get around churches that are different than the stream that you're in. It is easy to be kind of insular when you're just around the same types of people, and God willing, you have seen some success, and you kind of your playbook for the way you do things, your ministry philosophy or whatever, it can end up just being Bible. Like everything you do is just Bible. Like it's just you become fixed in that thinking. And yeah, I don't know. For me, traveling, going on mission trips, being in coaching groups, being around other people, it does maybe kind of open your eyes a little bit to the way God's working in different churches, different types of leaders. Any final kind of advice?
Yeah, I mean, to that point, I think that it's important to be around people and at least have your eyes up on what God is really doing around the world. I mean, I think that there is a really deep, good humility that comes with no matter where you're at, no matter what life stage your church is at. I mean, unless you're like, the 0.001%, God is doing something somewhere else that is just so far beyond where you are. Mm-hmm. And, some people are like kind of crushed by that. They don't love that. That's hard for me to understand, but I know it's a real thing. Like where it comes up a lot is like when people get real, this will be controversial. They don't love like when you're putting together a conference, like a pastor's conference, that it's like larger churches, that those pastors that are well known, that they're invited to come speak. And I think, people are like, well, they're not normative sized churches. And it's like, my take on it though is like, yeah, but man, that helps us all lift the lid of what God can do. I mean, if you got this church, down in Jacksonville that sees 1,500 baptisms in a day in the ocean, like I want to hear from that guy. Mm-hmm. If for nothing else, for me just to be inspired to like chase what could God do? Lift my the eyes of my heart a little bit and just sort of. So I think when we're willing to do that, it makes us much more receptive to coaching. Like if we're the biggest little fish, if we're the biggest fish in the little pond, and man, we're crushing it, and we go to whatever meeting, and we're sort of. Well, maybe it's a little harder to hear, hey man, you could do this differently or this differently. But then when all of a sudden you realize like, oh, there are churches in the U.S. that had 100,000 people attend on Easter. It's like, well, okay, maybe I got a little bit I can learn still. Right. Maybe I got a little bit I can, I got a little ways to go, so I think that helps me. And then I think on the rebuke thing, last thing I'll say is, you've heard the phrase before, like, man, you've got to build... you gotta build the dams and fortify the town before the storm is on the shore. And I think that's really true with some of the relational dynamics that are needed in terms of being able to receive a rebuke. Because, there needs to be a comfort and an openness that is built for a long time before the time comes when someone needs to call you on something, I think that it's I remember for us, I don't remember what it was, 6 or 8 years ago. It's very common. I've learned, I have a good mentor that is just a CEO kind of mentor kind of thing. And he's like, man, it's very common with people that are late 20s, early 30s that have had success to be like very driving leaders. Maybe on the borderline of harsh, but and this is what he said. He said because they've learned, first of all, they've had to coach people that are a lot older than them a lot, and they've learned like they've got to kind of be a little bit of a hard butt about stuff. But the second thing they've learned is if you put fire under people, you get results pretty fast.
Right.
And so they've learned to like put fire under people. The problem of that, of course, is that it's got a short kind of shelf life, and people don't want to be around that for that long. And I think for me, I probably fell into some of that. I don't think it's that uncommon, to want to be driving people and pushing, and it's always got to be. And to have different brothers say to me like, "Hey, man, it's not sin, but it's just kind of hard. It's hard to be around you sometimes. It's hard to work with you sometimes because you're always like driving. Everything has got to."
Right.
And it was about that time when, again, trying to be open to that same mentor was like, "Hey, man, the next iteration." Some guys that stay in middle management their whole life, they just never learn how to do anything but put fire under people. But real leaders figure out how to put fire in people and put it in their heart. And you stop trying to motivate them with short-term little consequences, and you try to drive them with vision or lead them with vision, And that was a huge turning point for me in my own leadership. But it never would have been able to happen if we hadn't built relationships on the front end where people could speak in. And I think, man, this is one of those things where sometimes, everything gets pitted a lot of times, large church, small church. Dude, sometimes small church are the ones where there's like a total tyrant at the top and he just controls everything. And there's nobody that can speak in. Now, that can happen in a big church too.
Right.
But either way, it's like, man, are we building in, community where people can speak in so that you can hear the rebuke?
Yeah, it is ironic. One illustration I've heard around this that I think is such a good illustration is like, you look in the arena of like sports or business. You take sports, for example, and you find someone that's like just at the top of the world at their game. They're going to get more coaching than anybody else, right? I mean, you take somebody, I've heard this about like Kobe Bryant, where it's like somebody like that, when he was like as great as he was, they'll have 7 coaches. You know what I mean? I mean, PT, a mindset coach, massage therapist.
Nutrition.
Yeah, I mean, same thing with people in business, it's like, man, yeah, they may have somebody coaching them on, how to lead people, how to speak, how to, finances, like how to think about this, how to do this. And it's just ironic in many ways. They're probably the ones that need coaching the least, but they're going out and pursuing coaching more than anybody else. Whereas you may have somebody that's kind of lower that's like, man, I don't need coaching. I don't need to hear from you. And yeah, it's ironic, and it's
they don't want to invest the money in it, or the energy in it. And it's like, you see these people at the top that are willing to invest, sometimes millions of dollars into that aspect of it because of what you're saying. They understand that they're the perceptive person in your scripture,
Right.
They're willing to take that rebuke.
Right. Yeah. Well, I hope this was helpful for you guys. One thing I'll throw out there before we go, we do have a private Facebook group that we're trying to build, and we really just want this to be a place that we can kind of help each other and learn from one another and, share best practices, share what our churches are doing to reach people. So if you haven't checked that out, I would encourage you guys to do that. Have a great day.
Thanks.